Can Europe man the ramparts on its own? As the US War Secretary snubbed a NATO defense ministers meeting in Brussels, EU leaders were converging on the 16th century Alden Biesen castle in Belgium's Limburg province. This to answer former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi's call for a big bazooka approach to reform and competitiveness. But behind the walls of the one-time headquarters of the Knights of the Teutonic Order, bit of a rift between France, pushing a bi-European approach to strategic autonomy, and a converging German-Italian couple, more focused on lightening regulation and striking new trade deals. How much of a sense of urgency when it comes to safeguarding strategic industries, energy, defense, financing the EU 27's needs? This old continent feels caught in a superpower squeeze these days. China with its flood of goods that are coming in. The United States with its adversarial trade policy and a full-throttled support for the Eurosceptic far-right parties. And Russia, which continues to pound Ukraine, just as Washington signals the end of its historic role as Europe's defense shield. When Mario Draghi was chair of the European Central Bank, he once assured that he would do whatever it takes to safeguard the continent's common currency. Markets believed him. For Europe circa 2026, what does whatever it takes look like? And who can deliver it? Today in the France 24 debate, can Europe boost its sovereignty in a hurry? With us from Madrid, he's a former NATO director of policy planning, Fabrice Potier, CEO at consultants Rasmussen Global. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to see you.
From London, Elizabeth Brow, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank's Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Marie Kripada is a Research Fellow at the Study Committee on Franco-German Relations at the think tank IFRI. Welcome.
Good evening.
And welcome back to Geopolitics, Professor Manlio Graziano, Professor Emeritus of Geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you?
How are you?
I'm okay. On the go, you can listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. Okay, so rather than a formidable fortress, the setting might seem like Disneyland for wonks, a castle in Flanders for an informal summit that gives EU leaders really a 5-week deadline. That's till their next formal summit in March.
The priority is to have a reaction first in the very short term, which consists of implementing everything on which we agree and going much faster on simplification, the deepening of the single market, energy issues, and financing.
Today it is above all about these topics. I am pleased that Emmanuel Macron and I, as almost always, are in agreement on these questions.
Almost always. Fabrice Potier, did you pick up on that?
Yes, you could even see the body language not being as warm as in their previous meetings. I think the dispute between Paris and Berlin on the next fighter jet program is probably creating more distance between the two leaders. And clearly you have a clash of philosophy here. You have the French approach that believes in the kind of industrial policy, supporting industrial champions across Europe with public subsidies. And you have a more mercantilist, more competitive and innovation-focused German approach, which wants to put just enough public money, but also rally more private investment. I do think the center of gravity is moving towards Berlin and Rome and few other capitals in the Nordics.
You know, we have, Fabrice, this situation where the U.S. is, we'll talk about it later in the show, just quietly sort of pulling back from NATO. You've always had in Europe, as long as I can remember, this Franco-German axis that motored the rest of the bloc. Is it unprecedented to see these balance of powers, as you've just described them, shift?
I think the Franco-German engine is showing some difficulties since the Sarkozy-Merkel era, quite frankly. And it went on getting worse, especially between Macron and Scholz, who clearly had very different views and personalities. Things got slightly better with the arrival of Chancellor Merz, but I think we are really at this crossroad where Europe needs to make some hard choices about where it's going to put its limited but important fiscal power. And clearly the French have a very extensive definition of that. And I think the Germans want to be more focused and more balanced between public and private. And I really think the Europeans need to solve that, because foreign powers, China, Russia, but also the United States, are watching, are in a way predating on our weaknesses, and it's time to show more strengths.
Yeah, on his way north to the castle of Alden Biesen, France's president making several stops this week. First, there was the steel plant in the French North Sea port of Dunkirk, where Emmanuel Macron was on hand for the opening of Europe's largest electric smelter. That sending a signal that he talked about green energy being used to make steel. Then to Antwerp for a European industry summit.
We need this European preference. We have to secure on strategic sectors a minimum percentage of European content in order to protect a systemic value chain-based approach. This is the only way not to be reactive.
Well, not a fan of that clarion call is Sweden's Prime Minister. Very skeptical of Buy European, conservative Ulf Kristersson, telling the Financial Times that we need to be able to compete because of quality and because of innovation, not because we try to protect the European markets. Elizabeth Brauge, this diametrically opposed views on Buy European, can they be overcome?
Well, much has been overcome in Europe, including the risk of war. So this will be overcome too. And frankly, it's not a surprise that Ulf Kristersson would make that observation. Sweden is a free trading nation, has a long history of free trade. That's how a smaller country that has a very significant private sector manages to do so well. So it's hardly a surprise. And Sweden has been able to function very well within the European Union ever since joining back in the 90s. But now we are, as you mentioned, at a crossroads where it's not just about perfecting the single market, but also about protecting the European way of life, including European industry, against countries that may wish to take advantage of it. That is where we are now. I think what is worth remembering is that this is not just decided by politicians. It will be decided by business leaders as well, who are as concerned, in many cases more concerned than politicians, than political leaders, about the threats facing European countries, European companies. And so they are an ally in this undertaking, as, by the way, are consumers who feel across Europe feel very strongly about the United States, about China, and that is something that strengthens the politicians' hands now that they are trying to solve this question.
So does Emmanuel Macron have a winning argument there, as we heard in that clip when he talks about Buy European?
I don't think he's going to convince all the other EU leaders that it should somehow engage in more protectionism. And I don't think that is what he's trying to accomplish either. But he does have allies among consumers across the European Union. We have seen an incredible increase in consumer sentiment in favor of buying European. Now, consumers clearly don't buy steel, they buy consumer products, but the sentiment is that.
You agree with that, Marie Capella?
Well, I think, Emmanuel Macron has been calling for a strategic autonomy since 2017 in his famous Sorbonne speech. And paradoxically, this narrative is echoed by the war in Ukraine. So there is now this acknowledgement in many European states, and first and foremost in Germany, that dependence is actually a vulnerability. Economic interdependence may be weaponized. And paradoxically, Emmanuel Macron is now very weak because of the domestic situation in France, because he doesn't have an absolute majority at the Assemblée Nationale in the French Parliament,
and he'll be out of a job in 15 months.
He'll be out of the job in 15 months. Plus, budgetarily speaking, France is very weak as well. So I think...
so you're saying it's the right message, but the wrong person to convey it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the right message. It's this French narrative. In some aspects, this has already worked. For instance, on security and defense, there is now a willingness to produce more in Europe, to get rid of the reliance on the USA on security and defense. But at the same time, the French position sometimes is also very paradoxical. If you look at the interview that Emmanuel Macron gave to Le Monde, for instance, he talks about diversification as well. So the need to have recourse to new suppliers or to other clients in order to reduce your vulnerability on single players like China and the US. But at the same time, France has not backed the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, which is also a reason of frictions between Berlin and Paris.
Manlio Graziano.
I think I'm sure that the problem exists, a problem of dependence to other countries, especially in terms of raw materials. It's very clear that after the invasion of Ukraine, it's clear to everybody. The fact is that if you react by protectionism, in my opinion, you worsen the situation, in the sense that protectionism is a kind of a disease which spreads very rapidly, and probably, no, I am sure that when the United States started, even before Donald Trump with the Inflation Recovery Act.
So how do you answer when China's share of market share in Europe skyrockets as it's done in the last year?
I think for the markets it's good in the sense that we lived in a period of globalization when this free market was useful for everybody. So I think it's not a bad thing. The problem is that today we are stuck in this new situation, new context, completely new, in which we see that we can lose from one day to another the principal sources of raw materials or energy, for example. And so the debate is open. But what I see here in Europe is that we have two opposite answers. That's the thing. When we discuss about Europe, we see always more divisions than unity. And in particular, for example, today they met for push the competitiveness of Europe, right? But with protectionism has always been the opposite of pushing the competitivity of a country, because it's especially I know very well because I'm coming from Italy, and they did for years to avoid to increase their productivity. They just used protectionism or maneuver on the currency, stuff like that, which is the opposite of. And today we have one country, and I understand when Merz say we always agree, because we have one country in particular, Germany, which is very focused on free market, and France, which is the weak link of the European chain, as we were seeing.
But we see Fabrice Potier with Germany's car industry having difficulty competing with China. Is that going to continue to be the same, that Germany and Europe will be as open for business as they've been?
I think we need to rethink where we put our industrial capacity. And clearly, there's a need to surge quite significantly in defense industrial production. And you do see some car manufacturers who are starting to switch their production towards the defense industry. I'm not saying this is the answer to everything, but I think we have to think creatively to also meet the threats that are not just economic threats. And then finally, on the electric vehicle industry, as long as Europe doesn't have a decent lithium refining supply chain of its own, instead of being 90+% dependent on the Chinese, I don't think we will be able to produce competitive cars. So I think we need to be much more serious about building a real lithium battery value chain in Europe, by Europe. This is where I think the Buy European Act could make sense, so that we can compete in a more equal way with Chinese players.
The EU informal summit staged the same day that Donald Trump over in Washington revokes a landmark scientific finding, one that seems obvious to many on this continent, that greenhouse gases endanger public health. The White House trumpeting it as the, quote, largest deregulatory action in American history. Back here in Europe, after the watering down of the Green New Deal's climate targets, Berlin and Rome leading the charge now for less red tape.
Here then, the European Union must make a choice, because if its strategy is to open up to free trade agreements, and Italy agrees with this, then it must also realise that it cannot continue to over-regulate, because we cannot enter into free trade agreements with systems that do not even come close to the standards we impose on our own producers.
Elizabeth Brau, what does that mean, not continue to over-regulate?
Well, I was just listening to German news again this morning, and just to give you an example, it was highlighted that German driving license tests need to be far less comprehensive than they are today. They have grown over the years with more and more questions, more and more skills that you have to master. Germany has a far more comprehensive driving test than most other countries, and the same is true for many other areas, including industrial production. And it's just a nature of regulation. When you have it, it works well, and then you might as well perfect it a little bit. But now that European countries, and including the EU, clearly need to expand trade with countries other than the United States, other than China, that includes countries like China, like the Mercosur countries, that have less regulation, that have maybe
but does that
less
mean
restrictions.
Does that mean a race to the bottom? That it means that regulations that protect consumers have to be loosened in the name of free trade?
That is the risk, and it is a real risk. And unfortunately, the good times of the 90s and early 2000s, when we thought that the world was heading in a unified direction, including the unified direction when it comes to climate change, reducing CO2 emissions to reduce the risk of severe climate change. Those times are over, but it is also the case that countries that are severely affected by climate change will want to reduce their CO2 emissions, including China. So it is really a quite complex situation. But the upside is that our countries are willing to do more trade with the European Union and with the UK.
Is Giorgia Meloni doing Donald Trump's bidding, Manley Gratiano, when she talks about not imposing, not doing deals, deregulating and the such? Again, this is on the day when Donald Trump is basically getting rid of all environmental regulations.
Yes and no, in the sense that this is something which is in the DNA of Giorgia Meloni and people like her. So let's say that they met. They met on the same path, which is a path of the regulation, of course. But it's there is something that sometimes we overlook, the fact that we live in a system where who is the more competitive wins. So this race toward the competitiveness used even on this deregulation is nothing new. It started with Ronald Reagan in the 80s. And it was very clear that since the United States became immediately...
So what you're saying is that we should be fatalistic about it? We should put hormones in the chicken?
I don't provide any kind of solution, but I just analyze what is the situation. The situation is that if we are since we are in a system of competition, it's clear that when someone finds a way to be more competitive, even without any thinking of people health or whatever, they do. And in this case, everybody follows up because they risk losing their place on their role and their place on the market. This is the situation. Then, as I said, I don't provide solutions, but and when we want to provide solutions, we need first to know the reality as it is.
Mario Capata, there's outrage among some here in France over a bill that's making its way through Parliament right now to roll back restrictions on pesticides and herbicides. Is that, again, in the name of free trade and making our farmers competitive with the rest of the planet, that we just have to do it and grin and bear it?
Yeah, I mean, this was a topic that came up also with the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, as you remember, where France blocked this agreement because of the pressure of French farmers. And Germany actually tried to find concessions. So there was this fund put up to compensate potential losses for French farmers or for European farmers in general. There are also safeguard measures that were put into the agreement to try to find a way to bring this agreement to fruition. But I think when it comes to simplification, what is meant here also by Giorgia Meloni and by Friedrich Merz is also to deepen the single market and is also to create a capital market union. So actually, when you look at the Draghi report, which was brought out in 2024, it said that 300 billion euros of European savings are actually fueling the American market and could be better used on the European market to invest in future-oriented technologies, future-oriented industries, for instance. And there is no incentive for the moment being to do that because we still have many standards and different standards within the European Union. The IMF brought out a figure, 44% of internal hidden tariffs within the single market for the trade of goods. And when it comes to services, it's 110%. So actually, the goal is also to deepen the European capital market and work on this deepening of the European market in general to make European companies thrive and also to make them reach critical mass in order to being able to be competitive against US players and Chinese players, for instance. So I think this is also an important topic. Mr. Jörg Kukis, who's the former Minister of Finance in Germany, and Christian Noyer, the former governor of the Central Bank, brought out a report on how to work on this capital market union very recently, for instance.
Yeah, it can sound a bit technical, Fabrice Potier, but this simplification of European financial regulation, is that something you foresee happening sooner than later?
I think the more the US become adversarial to our own security, but also economic interest, the more there is a sense of urgency among member states that they have to go further in cutting down red tapes, in actually also breaking some of the protectionist walls that we still have within the single market, not outside the single market, but within. So I think there is this new sense of urgency. The question, this is what we saw today, is whether there's going to be enough of a consensus among the main European economic powers to draw one direction where the EU is going to focus its effort. But it is obvious that right now, the EU has to find a new balance between being right and having the right values and setting some norms, but also of reducing the regulatory burden on business. Again, going back to the lithium and electric vehicle industry, the fact that there is no major lithium refinery plant in Europe is because the business case for making such investment is not strong enough because the regulation is so demanding that any company wanting to do that will think twice before making an investment. So we need to improve our regulatory environment, making it more business friendly without losing our European soul.
Yeah, it was certainly this issue of the batteries is something that's come up in places like Sweden and France. It was right around this time last year that jaws dropped as committed defenders of the US-led world order watched the US Vice President denounce not Russia, not China, but Europe's enemy within, as J.D. Vance put it, blasting wokeism and immigration. This was at the Munich Security Conference. This coming weekend, the conference is on again, and it'll be Secretary of State Marco Rubio who will be appearing in his stead. Rubio, who skipped the last NATO's foreign ministers meeting, just as his War Department counterpart Peter Hegseth has passed on the NATO defense ministers meeting that's taking place today in Brussels. Instead, meet Eldridge Colby. He's the Undersecretary for Policy, effectively the number 3 at the Pentagon.
We have a really strong basis for working together in partnership, but putting NATO kind of a 3.0 NATO that's based a partnership rather than dependency, and really a return to what NATO was originally intended for.
A partnership rather than dependency. Can you explain what that means, Fabrice Potier?
I think there's a great hypocrisy with this US administration partial withdrawal from NATO and from European security affairs. On one hand, I think they are right that I think Europe needs to stand on its own feet and take care more of its own security interests. But where they are, in a way, there is this hypocrisy, is they want to put less US resources across NATO, but they want the Europeans to buy more American weapon systems and intelligence systems. So I think they're trying to have it both ways, to save on their commitment to Europe, but to keep on gaining from European investment in their own industry. And this is why I think the call by President Macron and others to invest more in Europe-made defense capabilities and dual-use capabilities make complete sense, because now the US wants to be less European, and therefore the Europeans have to become more European in buying weapon systems.
Yeah, out of that Brussels NATO meeting this Thursday, the announcement that Sweden will be patrolling Arctic skies with fighter jets and send Rangers to exercise on Greenland and part of NATO's Arctic Sentry mission. They'll be, Elizabeth Brau, using those Gripen planes that are made in Sweden.
Yes, they will, and this is an example of neighbors helping one another. We should remember that President Trump's case for the United States gaining access to Greenland or getting Greenland was that European countries, Denmark wasn't able to defend it. Then, barely had he expressed those words or articulated those words, came pledges from other European countries to help the Danes protect Greenland, and this is part of it. Sweden is NATO's newest member, but certainly one of its most valuable, most committed, and always steps up when there is an ask, and this is an example of that. Finland too, and by the way, Sweden and Finland do better work than the vast majority of other NATO member states in providing comprehensive defense for their countries, and that is no mean feat. And on that note, when the criticism is made of Europe, quote unquote, it's not doing enough, that is an incredible disservice to some countries within Europe that do a whole lot more than almost anybody else. Countries like Estonia that never get credit for it when Europe gets lumped together as one.
When Sweden commits to sending those Gripen planes to the Arctic, is it to pick up the slack because the Americans are leaving, or is it to please Washington and hopes that they'll stay?
It is to please Washington, and I think that was part of there was a bit of misunderstanding after Trump had accelerated his talk about Greenland, and when countries like Sweden then stepped up and sent exploratory missions there, it was seen as somehow protecting Greenland against the United States. It was actually the opposite. It was showing that there is no need for America to somehow bail Greenland out, because European countries in support of Denmark are very much able to help provide security for Greenland against the threats that President Trump felt Greenland was not protected against.
Manuel Gratiano, France expelled U.S. bases in 1967. There are still plenty of U.S. troops on the continent, between 38 and 41,000 at any time. If you're Germany, home to lots of U.S. military installations, if you're Italy, home to lots of military installations, are you still, despite everything that's happened in the first 13 months of this Trump administration, secretly hoping the U.S. will stay and maybe it's all a bad dream?
As I said before, I don't hope, I don't want anything, just to try to
If you're Friedrich Merz or Giorgia Meloni, not you personally, I'm saying.
They do, for sure. Oh, they do. And I think that they will do whatever it takes to keep them there. Problem is that the trend is going in opposite ways. And it's clear when Exeter doesn't take part in the meeting with the other Minister of Defense, or Rubio, same with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It's another sign. But for me, the most important sign, and very clear, is the attack against Greenland. Because if there is a rationale behind it, is precisely to divide Europe, to attack Europe, to create a situation in which NATO doesn't mean anything anymore. And if it is the case, and we go back to this idea of European security and defense, if it is the case, it's much. There is no European defense. There is a defense of European countries. So you put the European countries against each other. That's and I think that if there is a strategy, this is the strategy of the United States.
To pit European countries against one another, you agree with that, Marie Kripke?
Yeah, I mean, we see that within the MAGA movement, there may be an interest, indeed, to make strong relationships with certain far-right parties. You mentioned the Munich Security Conference last year, where J.D. Vance, the vice president, said that threats for Europe are not coming from outside of Europe, but from within. And he mentioned the AfD, so the Alternative für Deutschland,
which is invited this year to that Munich Security
Exactly.
Conference.
And he's, basically the US were saying that there is no freedom of expression if the AfD cannot make their voice heard, and Elon Musk even giving them a platform with X, so that was an interference into the German elections.
They're trying to stir divisions. Manuel Gratiano, they're running down the list. Let's see. There was the Munich Security Conference speech. There was that big strategy paper put forth by the Pentagon. There was Greenland. And yet, there's still this hope in Germany and Italy that the United States will stick around and keep its military base?
Yeah, I mean, what was quite interesting in February last year, when the elections took place, the federal elections in Germany, Friedrich Merz said that Europe needs to take its responsibility, it needs to be independent, because the US are not interested in the fate of Europe anymore. But then, of course, he went to the White House, he brought the birth certificate of Trump's grandfather, so he tried to be pragmatic with Donald Trump, and so on and so forth. But let's face it, I mean, there are 37,000 US soldiers in Germany, so that is also a security guarantee in terms of nuclear deterrence. Also, the US are important for Germany. Friedrich Merz reached out to the nuclear powers within Europe, so to the UK and France, seeing whether the vital interests of France may be extended to other European countries and also Germany. So that is reaching out to France, for instance. But France France will not be an alternative to the US. It can be a complement as long as there are no nuclear sharing agreements between France and Germany, as between the US and Germany, it cannot be an alternative.
Fabrice Potier, you agree?
I think I agree with the fact that France can complement the US deterrent, can extend its deterrence to other European countries I would say, in a symbolic way. For example, by having dual-capable Rafale aircraft on German soil or other NATO Europe countries. But that won't match, obviously, the main nuclear threat and nuclear power to be deterred, which is Russia. So numbers matter, and the only power that can match the Russian numbers, which are the highest in the world, are the American ones. So I think it's about what Europe can do more to be able to increasingly stand on its feet. In certain domains, it will be able to do it almost entirely. In other domains like nuclear deterrence, I think there has to be a degree for a long time of transatlantic cooperation. And that explains, I think, also the reluctance of some NATO Europe allies in pulling the plug, in going all the way to full autonomy, because they know this is not entirely realistic. But in certain domains, I think in conventional deterrence, not using nuclear weapons, I think this is where Europe needs to be much more in control of its own destiny and to be able to deter a conventional Russian threat.
Yeah, you mentioned, speaking of, you talked about the Rafale made by Dassault. There was a joint op-ed piece Wednesday in German business daily Handelsblatt, the CEO of German Aerospace Industries Association and the deputy head of the powerful IG Metall labor union, effectively calling for tearing up plans for a common Franco-German-Spanish SCAF fighter jet project, instead proposing a two-aircraft approach. Frictions between Airbus and French aviation maker Dassault forcing the French president to again this week deny that the project was dead. This is Italian publication Il 24 Hours Sole, writing Dassault managing director Éric Trappier made this clear: "We're very willing to cooperate with partners, including the Germans, but we do not need them." Fabrice, is the project dead?
Yes. It doesn't look good. And I think there is a clear, huge gap between Paris and Berlin. But technically, it is true that probably Dassault can produce its own fifth/sixth generation combat aircraft. However, it's not just about technology, it's about economics. And the cost of doing so only for one customer, i.e. France, will be quite substantial. So what you end up with is France's defense budget will be burned into this new program, and as well as in the French nuclear deterrent, and you won't have much left for other things. So it's about the economy of scale here, and not working at a European level means that we are not going to save money per unit. And we are not going to be able to basically have both fifth generation aircraft, new generation tanks, more artillery, and more asymmetric hybrid means like drones and deep strikes. So I think this, in a way, the French are right from a technology point of view. We have what it takes to build a fifth generation, but we are losing again that industrial race that the Russians, the Chinese, but also the Americans have put against us.
Being able to produce at scale. And just to add another precinct that was heard from this Thursday, even though the costs have tripled from initial estimates, Italy's parliament has approved the Global Combat Air Program, this in coordination with Japan and the UK. Expected delivery date 2035. So you have GCAP, you have SCAF, and you have Dassault saying, if we want, we can make Rafales on our own. At what point, picking up on Fabrice Potier's point about the economics of it all, is there the political will to tell everybody, hey, this is the plane we're making?
Yeah, I think that the problem is not only technical, but economic, but also political, in the sense that finally there should be a political decision about that, And it seems that this political decision is lacking so far. So
who's the person who can break this deadlock, if you will?
I have no idea. Certainly not Macron, because he's too weak today to impose his will to the rest of the Europeans. Certainly not Italy either, because Italy is Italy, so it has to play in its category. And so I don't know, really don't know, but the problem exists. And if they don't find a political solution, there will be always this dispersion of people going everywhere. And many of them still depending on the United States, because this is the focal point. When they say that independence is not realistic, it's true, but at the same time, the countries in Europe need to deal with the fact that the Americans are withdrawing from Europe. And there will be probably not immediately, not in the next few years, but it will be.
Elizabeth Brau withdrawing, but still selling F-35 fighter jets.
That is the case, but who knows how many F-35 fighter jets they will be selling in the future. We have already seen countries getting cold feet, Canada, for example, getting cold feet about the F-35. And looking at the state of American relations with friends and allies, that is unsurprising. So where it used to be the case in the past that the United States could sell military equipment pretty easily to other countries because those countries knew that they were buying not just equipment, but American friendship. That is not the case anymore. So it's going to be a whole lot harder to sell those F-35s, and that is to the advantage of European alternatives.
All right, Europe underfunded, Europe divided, and yet it has filled the void left by the United States in Ukraine, at least financially. According to the Kiel Institute think tank, last year, military aid from this continent rose by 67% above that period from 2022 to 2024. Non-military aid by 59%. As you can see in this graph, the part in blue is the European aid. Again, Mari Krapata, your thoughts, because it's 5 weeks to go till this EU summit. Can we expect anything from it? And your thoughts when you looked at that graph?
Well, I think what is a bit disturbing is that Europe is not at a negotiating table. So if you look at the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, where Russia and the US and Ukraine negotiate on a potential peace deal, a potential ceasefire, Europe is not there. So Europe does pay. It does pay for Ukraine and to support Ukraine, but it is not on the negotiating table. And we're actually dealing with Europe's security architecture, which was shattered by the war in Ukraine in 2022, but even before that in 2014. So Europe is legitimate if it says it wants to be at the negotiating table. And so that is something, I mean, you know, that's what Macron said also in his interview in Le Monde. He said the Americans are actually negotiating the accession of Ukraine to the European Union. I mean, without the European Union being actually there. So this is very disturbing, actually.
Fabrice Potier, we're out of time. How does Europe get a seat at the table?
I think by showing a bit more steel and a bit more military power, because you're right that from a financial point of view, the EU has taken over the burden of supporting Ukraine. But what's missing here is that Europe does not count in terms of rapport de force vis-à-vis Russia. And as long as that's the case, only the United States can pressure Russia and sadly also Ukraine. And as long as that's the case, we are going to struggle to have a seat at the table. So we have to show more willingness to put real military skin in the game. I think this is what the leaders are trying with the coalition of the willing. But in my view, it doesn't go far enough because it is all dependent on the ceasefire that has to be decided also by Russia. So Russia has all incentives not to let the Europeans be present on the ground from a military point of view. So we should start now. There are creative things we can do to show that European military power matter when it comes to Ukraine.
We'll have to leave it there for now. Fabrice Potier, so many thanks for joining us. from Madrid. I want to thank Elizabeth Brau in London, Mario Capada, Manlio Graziano. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.